Thomas Robert Malthus. He must have been the life at every party he went to. So his book was known on an essay of population. He was the founder of demography, the study of populations. And his thesis of this book was that economic growth leads to catastrophe, since it leads to increases in population, but not increases in the food supply. The translation, economic growth is bad. He argued against economic growth, and that if we promoted economic growth, it would lead to disaster. And this graphic shows why. So you see that over time, as the population grows, the population is growing at an exponential rate. It continues to grow faster and faster and faster, while the growth of food is arithmetically, meaning that it grows, but just not enough to keep up with population. And there comes some point in time where the growth of population is going to overcome the growth of food production, and now there's going to be starvation. And those that are most vulnerable are going to be the population that dies. And so we argue that this will lead to catastrophe. And once you get the vulnerable part of the population that dies, population drops dramatically, and we go back to where we're at over time. We see the growth of these two things. And so we argue against economic growth. And it turns out he was right. Throughout his entire time, we see that these trends of when we see growth, then we see falling, growth, and then falling. And it wasn't until he wrote his work in 1798 that he then was proved wrong. And part of that is because he didn't take into account the role of technology. Is if all you think about are fixed inputs, land, labor, capital, those might be fixed. But technology is the process of taking fixed inputs and increasing the output. And that's one thing he didn't account for. And it's really technology that's allowed us to be able to meet this growing demand. And so we talk about the examples of Malthusian today. This Malthusian trap or Malthusian arguments. Overpopulation, or the population of the world, is a big issue. So in 1800, we had 1 billion people. 1928, 2 billion. 3 billion, 1960. 15 years later, 4 billion. And now in 2020, it's 7.8 billion. The question is, how can we maintain such large populations if the resources in the earth are only getting smaller? And the argument is because of technology. We can take the same number of inputs, or even fewer inputs, and increase our outputs through technology. Another example is Social Security will not be there when I retire, right? Talk to your parents or grandparents. They always make these comments. And that's not true because they're not taking into account technology. Well, fewer workers are paying in, more workers are receiving payments. Well, technology might be able to change this. That maybe it's going to be, even though fewer workers are paying in, they're paying in more amounts because of the growth of wages. Another argument we see is we'll run out of fossil fuels by 2050. The current usages will change over time. We'll find alternative sources of energy and technology will change. One of the examples of this that was used was the issues of manure from horses in major cities. And around 1900, 1910s, this was a major issue. And the question is, how do we deal with all this manure? Right? We just can't hire horses to transport the manure out. What do we do? And it was not anything they dealt with that, but it was the change in technology towards automobiles that led us to solving that problem. And so Malthus argued against economic growth. And because of what we call this Malthusian trap, where he didn't take into account the role of technology. The next thinker is David Ricardo. And David Ricardo focused on similar issues, but he focused more on what we call political economy. So his book was on the principle of political economy and taxation. And he had 4 major contributions we're going to talk about. He helped establish the gold standard. He talked about the law of diminishing returns, gains from international trade, and this probably most influential thing was the labor theory of value. So first, he focused on the gold standard. So he was very wealthy in England. He was very influential. And he argued that countries that print their own money are at risk of running into inflation, that there's no rule to determine how much they should print. And so if they print too much, then the value of the money diminishes and becomes worthless. And so he argued by having the gold standard, or for every banknote or every note in circulation, every dollar bill in circulation, it's matched to gold in storage. And that would then commit countries to a monetary policy, to not being able to print too much money and cause inflation. And so as countries found more gold, it would increase their amount to produce more money. And so he focused on that. And after his life, England adopted the gold standard and many other countries thereafter. He also talked about the law of diminishing returns. So he said is if you focus on the most fertile parts to grow of the field to grow, then you're going to get really high returns. But once you plant that, if in this picture, if you want to keep planting, you're going to have to clear those trees. And that means you're going to get less out of as you increase production. And so this law of diminishing return is that the gains or the increases are going to diminish slowly over time. And as a result of this law, he argued that there are great gains from international trade. So if a country has greater need for goods, rather than keep planting and experiencing diminishing returns is if you focus on trading with other countries, we can meet those demands. And so he argues is if you're in England, then don't try to grow citrus fruit. You don't have the right climate for it. It takes too many resources to do so. Instead, focus on what you're good at and let Portugal, let Spain grow the citrus fruit and trade from them. As a result, both countries will be better off through gains from international trade. And he was a very big proponent of international trade. He also argued this notion of wages and profit. So very similar to Malthus, he argued that if wages increase, people then who are wealthier begin to reproduce more. And if they reproduce more, then there becomes more workers and wages will go down. And this will affect profits. And eventually wages will go down so much that there'll be suffering, there'll be unemployment and poverty. And so he argued not for increases in wages, but rather more importantly for increases in profits. And so this argument of increasing wages leads to disaster is why oftentimes economics is known as a dismal science. And we can thank Malthus and Ricardo for that. The last thing that he talked about is actually really important. He wanted to find what he called an invariable measure of value, something that measures the value outside of currency. And so he used labor as his value of measure. That is, he looked to see how much time it took to produce a specific good. And if it took more time, that good would have more value. If it took less time, it would have less value. And the reason why this was so important is because this became widely accepted. And Karl Marx built his theory upon this. This notion that if it's the workers and the labor that's creating value, then maybe it's the workers and the labor that should receive the benefits of that creation of value. Now, J.B. Say would oppose this. He would argue that it's actually subjective utility that should determine value. And there's not an invariable measure, but rather a subjective measure of value. But this was a very large contribution of Ricardo because it's upon which Karl Marx built his theory.